Chapter 14. St John the Evangelist. St John the Evangelist was one of the martyrs in the reign of Domitian. Our Lord had promised him and his brother St James that they should both drink of his chalice and be baptized with his baptism, but the promise was very differently fulfilled to each of them. St James was martyred a few years after, being the first of the apostles to receive his heavenly reward, while St John lived to a very great age, long after all the other apostles, and at last died a natural death. Still, he is always looked on as a martyr, both because of our Lord's promise and because he actually suffered what would have killed him if it had not pleased our Lord to save his life by a miracle. Every Catholic knows that St John was the disciple whom Jesus loved in a peculiar way, that he leaned on Jesus' breast at the Last Supper, that as Jesus was hanging on the cross, he gave our dear Lady into his charge, and that during the 15 years that she lived after our Lord, St John waited on her and took care of her like a most dutiful and affectionate son. When we think of all these things, we cannot wonder that St John should have been the apostle of love. One of the fathers of the Church says that even the cherubim and the seraphim learned many things from St John and listened to him with great attention. St John preached the gospel in Phrygia and Parthia, and some say that he travelled as far as India. But his chief charge was Asia Minor, where he founded the 7 churches of Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Philadelphia, Sardis, and Laodicea. He spent most of his time in Ephesus, where there was a famous temple dedicated to the goddess Diana. This temple drew a great many people of all classes to Ephesus, so that the city was both a very rich and a very wicked place, for the worship of the pagan gods was so very impure that wherever it flourished, the most horrible sins were practiced under the name of religion. It was, therefore, no easy task to preach the gospel at Ephesus. But St John did not despair that the grace of God could convert even such hard hearts as those of the Ephesians. And so he went on month after month and year after year, preaching to them, setting them a very holy example, and winning them by the sweetness and gentleness of his conversation, till at last in this place, which had been filled with evil spirits and devoted to the service of the devils, a flourishing church was established, and prayers and hymns rose night and day in honour of the one true God. St John had a great many enemies among the wicked men who worshipped the goddess Diana. And when the Emperor Domitian began to persecute the Christians, they accused him of being a very dangerous sort of person who had great influence with the people. Domitian therefore ordered him to be sent to Rome, in order that he himself might cross-question him. St John was now about 90 years old, and though his mind was as strong as ever, his body was feeble and bowed down with age. But the Roman soldiers who had charge of him were a hard-hearted set. They took no notice of his holy and venerable countenance, or of his great age, but loaded him with heavy chains, which bent him down double and made his whole body ache. When St John arrived at Rome, he was taken before the emperor, who asked him several questions, to all of which he gave bold and straightforward answers. Domitian, however, was not satisfied. He was of such a suspicious temper that the more simple were St John's answers, the more certain he felt that there must be something very deep hid under them. St John also worked several miracles before him, casting out devils, healing the sick, and even raising the dead to life. But this only made his case the worse, for Domitian now hated him because he was so superior to himself, and he therefore condemned him to be put to a very cruel death. It was the Roman custom to scourge all persons who were condemned to die, and accordingly St. John was stripped, and in spite of his age and weakness, was scourged till his bones were bare and the blood poured down. He was then taken to a place outside of the city, just beyond one of the gates, which is still called the Latin Gate. The fame of his preaching and his miracles was widely spread abroad, and the whole Senate and an immense crowd of people were assembled to look at him and to witness the horrible punishment which was going to be inflicted on him. It was indeed a horrible death, for the devil had put it into Domitian's head to invent a new kind of torture for the apostle, whom he hated more than any of the others, only because Jesus loved him most. A great cauldron of oil was prepared, and a large fire was placed under it, and when the oil was boiling, St. John was roughly stripped and thrown in. His wounds, from the scourging, were raw and bleeding, and it makes one shudder to think how they would naturally have smarted when the boiling oil touched them, and how great would have been the pain of the burns all over his body, for nothing penetrates and burns more than boiling oil. But as soon as the saint touched the oil, the fire seemed to lose its force, and the oil appeared to be changed into a gentle dew from heaven, so that it felt soft and soothing to his wounds, and instead of being a torment, it was only a refreshment to him. When the executioners saw this strange sight, they thought that perhaps they had not made the fire hot enough, so they went to stir it up and add fresh fuel to it. But God was resolved to show that St. John was preserved by a miracle, and not through any fault in the fire. So he caused the fire to blaze up so fiercely that it caught some of those who were stirring it up and burned them to death, while at the same time St. John remained unhurt. At last, finding there was no use in keeping him any longer in the cauldron, they took him out, shining like an angel, and stronger and more vigorous than when he went in. The emperor was in a furious rage at what had happened, and as the miracle made a great noise in Rome and set everyone talking about this wonderful saint and his new religion, he became more suspicious and afraid of him than ever. But what could he do against such a man? It was plain that there was no use in trying to kill him. Still, he must be got out of the way somehow or other, and so he was banished to Patmos, a small island near Crete, where he was set to work in the mines. This banishment was not much of a punishment for St. John, for he knew that wherever he went, our Lord went with him, and it was while he was at Patmos that he was favoured with the wonderful visions which are described in the Apocalypse. Here too St. John could find work to do for Jesus, and while he was working in the mines, he found opportunities of preaching the gospel to the poor and ignorant miners, many of whom were converted and baptized. After St. John had spent some time in the island of Patmos, Domitian was murdered by his own servants, and the new emperor, Nerva, allowed all those who had been banished by him to return home. The people of Patmos were very sorry to part with their dear apostle, but he could not remain longer with them, because he had a great deal to do in looking after the churches which he had founded in different places. So he returned to Ephesus and spent the few remaining years of his life in going from time to visit the neighbouring churches, as bishops do now, for the purpose of seeing that sound doctrine continued to be taught by the priests, and of warning the people not to be led away by heretical teachers who, even so early as St. John's time, began to deceive foolish people and to persuade them to wander away from the true fold of Christ, which is the Catholic Church. The following story shows what love St. John had for souls, and what care he took of those who were under his charge. It happened that when he was paying one of his usual visits to a city in Asia, he saw a youth of a very pleasing countenance. He spoke to him, and found that he had good abilities, and that if he were well educated, he might turn out to be a very good minister of the gospel. Accordingly, when St. John was about to leave the city, he gave this youth in charge to the bishop, and said to him, "Take charge of him, and train him carefully, for I commend him to you with all earnestness, in the presence of the Church and of Christ." The bishop promised to do what St. John bade him, and taking the youth home to his own house, he began to teach him how to live a Christian life. At first, he looked after him very carefully, and the youth seemed to be going on very well. But after some time the bishop began to look after him less strictly, and to let him have more and more liberty, and the consequence was that he fell into bad company, and was led away to all the feasts and merry makings of the pagans. The bishop now tried to check him, but it was too late. The youth was headstrong, and like a restive horse which has got the bit between his teeth, nothing would restrain him and prevent his taking his own way. He went on from one thing to another, and from venial sins to mortal sins, till at last he became the captain of a band of robbers who infested the neighbourhood, plundering and murdering everyone who fell into their hands. Time passed on, and at length St. John came again to the city. After having finished all his other business, he turned to the bishop, and said to him, "Come, return me my deposit, which I and Christ committed to thee in the presence of the Church, over which thou dost preside." The bishop was puzzled and distressed when he heard St. John's words, for he thought that St. John was asking about some money which he had given him to take care of, and as he could not remember that he had received any money, it was impossible for him to give an account of it. But at last he understood that St. John was asking him for an account, not of money, but of the soul of the young man who had been committed to him. And as soon as he found this out, he began to cry and groan, and he said, "Alas, alas, he is dead, he is dead." "Dead?" cried St. John. "How and by what death did he die?" "He is dead to God," replied the bishop. "He has turned out a very wicked man, and has at last become a robber, so that, instead of serving in the church, he now wanders about the neighbouring mountains at the head of a band of robbers." On hearing this grievous news, the apostle tore his clothes for grief, and making great lamentations, he exclaimed, "To a fine keeper indeed did I commit the soul of my brother, but get a horse ready immediately, and hire a trusty guide to show me the way to the mountain." The horse and guide were instantly got ready, and St. John rode away quickly from the church to the mountain where the robbers lived. When he reached their outguard, the robbers came up to him to make him prisoner. But, instead of trying to run away from them, he only cried out, "For this very purpose am I come. Take me to your captain." The robbers led him to their captain, who stood, armed, in the middle of the company, ready to receive the prisoner. But the moment the young robber cast his eyes on the apostle, he remembered him, and, being very much ashamed of himself, he fled from him. St. John, however, forgetting his old age, ran after him with all his might, crying out, "Why dost thou fly, my son, from me, thy father, thy aged, defenceless father? Have compassion on me, my son. Fear not, there is still hope for thee. I will intercede with Christ for thee. I am ready to die cheerfully for thee, as our Lord Jesus Christ died for me, and to give my soul for thine. Stop, stop, for believe me, Christ hath sent me." The hard heart of this prodigal son was touched with these loving words. He stopped, stood like a culprit with downcast looks, hid his right hand with which he had shed so much blood, and trembling all over, threw himself at the feet of the apostle and prayed for mercy. St. John raised him up, and embracing him, kissed the hand which he was hiding for shame, and assured him that Jesus would pardon all his sins. He then desired him to fast and pray constantly for several days, while he himself did the same, and he never left him till he was perfectly contrite and was restored to the Church. Some writers say that St. John lived to be 100 years old, and others that he was only 93 when he died. His precise age is of little consequence. We know that he lived to be so old and infirm that he was unable to walk, and yet his love of souls was still so great that he could not bring himself to give up the charge of the churches. He was so filled with love to his neighbour that no other word or precept seemed ever to pass his lips. When he used to be carried into the church and was so weak that he could hardly speak, he constantly repeated to the people who gathered round him for instruction, "Little children, love one another." His disciples, tired with always hearing the same words, asked him why he never said anything else to them, and he answered, "Because it is the precept of our Lord, and if it be fulfilled, it alone is sufficient." Some people fancy that it is very charitable to be as good friends with heretics as with good Christians, but St. John did not think so. Though he was so filled with the love of Jesus and with love for the souls of heretics that he would have done anything to turn them away from their sins, yet he could not bear to be in their company, except for the purpose of converting them. It happened that one day he went to the public bath at Ephesus, but on entering it, he found that a great heretic called Cerinthus was there. As soon as he saw him, he instantly turned round and went out in great haste, saying to those who were with him, "Let us flee, lest the bath should fall while Cerinthus, an enemy of the truth, is in it." St. John had to wait a long time to receive the reward which Jesus had promised him so long before, but at last the happy hour arrived. A short time before he died, God revealed to him that he was going to take him to himself. So he called together his disciples and gave them his last instructions and his blessing, and after taking leave of them, he expired peacefully on the 27th of December, AD 100.